We look at the sprawling chaos of the modern American empire. Nuclear test sites bloom in the desert. The server farms of the Central Intelligence Agency hum in the dark. Trillions of dollars vanish on crashing Wall Street trading floors. But watch what happens when we reverse the flow of time and capital. The lines of influence snap backward across the map, converging onto a single, windowless brownstone building in New Haven, Connecticut. An anomaly of scale. You step into a voting booth, pull a curtain, and believe you are steering the ship of state. It is a beautiful, comforting simulation. The architecture of your reality, the intelligence apparatus monitoring your digital footprint, the macroeconomic policies quietly draining your savings, is not drafted in the public square. It is written in locked rooms by men eternally bound in college crypts. If you do not understand this hidden sociology, your freedom is merely a ghost. We are going to decode the psychological alchemy of what they call the tomb. I'm not here to entertain you with cheap ghost stories or paranoid internet mythologies. We are going to dissect the precise, cold machinery that turns 15 privileged youths a year into the architects of the shadow state. We will give you the forensic lens to see the hidden choreography of world events. The blueprint of power is not a secret. It is a highly predictable algorithm. A heavy iron padlock turns in the dead of night on High Street. We stand before the blank sandstone facade of the tomb. No windows, no fire escapes. It looms like a silent, windowless monolith against the Gothic spires of the university. The air is cold, heavy with the weight of unspoken pacts. We push straight through the ancient stone, a digital ghost passing into the forbidden interior. Inside, a deafening clock ticks in a dark, wood-paneled room. Deep underground, in the climate-controlled sub-basement of the university library, the sociological archivist sits surrounded by century-old admission ledgers. To the archivist, this is not a history of a student club. Looking at the faded sepia photographs of young men, they feel a quiet, melancholic realization. They see the invisible threads connecting these smooth, untested faces directly to planetary-scale catastrophes and triumphs. The ink on these pages is written in blood. The archivist traces a finger over a founding charter dated 1832. At a moment when the young American Republic was still violently defining its aristocracy, this institution was born as a closed loop of influence. It was designed from the very first breath to isolate the apex of the social hierarchy, sealing them away from the chaos of democratic meritocracy. A shadow patrician class quietly carving up a continent before it was even fully mapped. The mechanism of this power relies on the brutal mathematics of exclusion. Every spring, exactly 15 college juniors are tapped for membership. Not 16, not 14. The archivist understands the poetry of this artificial scarcity. By strictly limiting the intake, they transform power into an infinitely dense, hyper-concentrated commodity. It is an archetype of control, binding a microscopic fraction of a generation into an unbreakable, lifelong phalanx. Consider the sheer spatial absurdity of the evidence before us. The physical structure of the tomb measures roughly 40 feet by 60 feet. You could fit the entire building inside a standard tennis court. Yet, the alumni network forged within those suffocating walls commands financial institutions, hedge funds, and shadow banking syndicates that manage trillions of dollars. A tiny box of wood and stone, acting as the gravitational center for the wealth of nations. The archivist cross-references the faces in the sepia photographs with the highest offices of the land. Out of hundreds of millions of citizens living and dying in the American experiment, This tiny, isolated cohort has produced 3 presidents of the United States. It has birthed dozens of cabinet members and multiple directors of Central Intelligence. The same 15-man ritual echoes in the Oval Office and the darkest corridors of Langley. As a detective looking at a crime scene, I must tell you that this data is a sprawling, glaring anomaly. In a truly random, chaotic universe, this concentration of destiny is mathematically impossible. The numbers scream that a thumb is resting heavily on the scale of human history. The archivist closes the ledger, the dust of a century swirling in the pale light. We are staring at a structural glitch in the matrix of global democracy. In any investigation, you must first locate the victim. Here, the corpse is the concept of chance itself. The data we have uncovered represents the death of probability. When the same handful of family names from the same windowless crypt continuously orchestrate war, peace, and economic collapse across decades, we are no longer observing coincidences. We are observing the forensic residue of an active, ongoing sociological machine. So, we find ourselves standing before the abyss of a profoundly unsettling question. If this concentration of planetary influence is not the result of democratic will, and if we reject the infantile fantasies of dark magic, then what exactly is happening inside those sandstone walls? How do you take a handful of privileged students and rewire their neurology to believe they are the rightful shepherds of human history? We are faced with a terrifying statistical impossibility. How can one microscopically small group produce such a vastly disproportionate number of world leaders, bypassing the noise and friction of an entire continent? The answer lies in the psychological black box of the tomb itself. We must step into the darkness of the initiation to witness the exact moment a human being is broken down and an architect of empire is born. I'm stepping into that very darkness now, leaving the cold statistics of the archivist behind to enter a claustrophobic, wood-paneled room lit only by the trembling glow of candlelight. The air is heavy, thick with the scent of old dust and sweat. In the center of the floor lies a mud-caked wrestling mat, a visceral altar for the ritual to come. Shadows dance across the faces of 15 young men sitting in a tight circle, their eyes wide with a quiet, collective terror. As an investigator of human nature, I look at these 15 faces and see a ticking time bomb of ambition. These are the apex predators of the American elite. So, I must ask you a terrifying question. How do you guarantee absolute silence among the most competitive, self-serving people on the planet? How do you build an architecture of trust so impenetrable that it survives world wars and market crashes? You do not ask for their loyalty. You simply destroy their boundaries. What we are witnessing is not a college prank, but a highly sophisticated, grueling process of psychological deconstruction. The whispers in this room overlap, echoing like shards of fracturing glass in the minds of the initiates. The protocol demands that each young man must sit before his peers and orally dissect his own psyche. He is commanded to recount his entire intimate history to the group, leaving absolutely no shadow unexposed, no childhood trauma hidden from the collective. I watch as the defense mechanisms of a lifetime are systematically dismantled. Every shameful secret, every deep-seated insecurity, every illicit desire is laid bare on that muddy mat. The mind is stripped of its protective armor, left raw and bleeding under the unforgiving gaze of 14 other men. This is the poetry of a complete psychological surrender. The individual is being hollowed out, transformed from a sovereign citizen into a porous vessel waiting to be filled. You must understand the dark mathematics at play here. This exhaustive confession establishes a bedrock of mutually assured destruction. By the time the final candle burns low, every single man in this room holds the absolute darkest secrets of everyone else. It is a forensic ledger of human vulnerability, locked away in 15 overlapping vaults. If one man falls, he has the ammunition to bring the entire future power structure of the United States crashing down with him. I trace the invisible lines of leverage connecting these trembling initiates. Through this shared vulnerability, betrayal instantly becomes a mathematically irrational act. To testify against a brother, to expose the inner workings of their future empires, would mean total personal and social annihilation. It is a brilliant, terrifying mechanism of control. They are forging chains not out of iron, but out of shame and complicity, binding their destinies together forever. But the architecture of this crypt requires more than just blackmail. It requires a metaphysical transformation. The ritual unfolding before me is explicitly designed to simulate physical death and rebirth. I observe an initiate being metaphorically buried, enveloped in the darkness of an actual coffin, forced to confront the abyss of his own mortality. He must listen to the mocking voices of his peers, representing the indifferent universe, crushing his former ego into the dirt. When he finally emerges from that suffocating darkness, the boy who entered the tomb is dead. His prior identity, his allegiances to the outside world, his moral compass, all of it has been incinerated in the crucible of this initiation. In its place, the ritual implants a collective consciousness that is entirely subservient to the brotherhood. He no longer says the word I. His neurology has been completely hijacked to only understand the world through the primal survival of the we. Modern clinical psychologists have a sterile term for this haunting metamorphosis. They refer to it as intense in-group cohesion. But standing in this candlelit room, I see it for what it truly is: a deliberate neurochemical rewiring of the human brain. The extreme stress, the exhaustion, the trauma of the mud and the coffin trigger massive floods of cortisol and oxytocin, fusing these 15 strangers together with a ferocity that mimics the bonds forged in bloody military combat. This hacked biology creates a terrifying new hierarchy of loyalty. The initiate is reprogrammed to prioritize the fraternity above all external constructs. The survival of the brotherhood now supersedes the authority of the state, the sanctity of the law, and even the blood ties of his own family. I am watching the ultimate sociological anomaly take shape. They are not just forming a secret club. They are giving birth to an autonomous, parasitic organism within the host of the Republic. Look closely at the mud on that wrestling mat. It is the primal clay from which a century of geopolitical dominance is sculpted. As an investigator, I have seen crime scenes where blood was spilled for a handful of dollars. But here, the currency is the human soul. They are buying the absolute allegiance of future presidents and intelligence directors for the price of their deepest traumas. The genius of the tomb is that it does not recruit powerful men. It manufactures them from broken boys. You walk past these Gothic buildings believing that the future of the nation is decided in public debates and open elections. But I'm showing you the dark, beating heart of the true process. The echo of these whispered confessions will soon reverberate across the trading floors of Wall Street and the sealed briefing rooms of Langley. The decisions that will bankrupt your savings, or send your children to war are seeded right here, in the engineered paranoia of these 15 entwined minds. The candles begin to flicker and die, plunging the room into absolute, terrifying darkness. The psychological deconstruction is complete, and the unbreakable bond has been forged in the fire of shared humiliation. But a brotherhood built on trauma is just a weapon waiting to be wielded. As the dawn breaks over New Haven, these newly minted architects of power will step out of the crypt and look toward their first target. They need to test their collective strength on the engine of capital. The sun rises over the Gothic spires of New Haven, but the newly forged brotherhood does not linger in the light. Armed with their unbreakable, trauma-induced psychological bond, they immediately seek a host organism to colonize. Loyalty, no matter how absolute, is merely a potential energy. To shape history, they needed kinetic force. They needed the raw, pulsating engine of American capital. I track their movements from the ivy-covered sanctuaries to the concrete canyons of New York. Look at the chaotic, sepia-toned expanse of the 1920s Wall Street trading floor. Men in tailored suits shouting over the deafening clatter of ticker-tape machines. To the untrained eye, it is a free market governed by the invisible hand of Adam Smith. But follow the endless ribbons of paper spilling onto the floor. As I cross-reference these transaction ledgers, the printed letters blur and reassemble into familiar names. The names of the very men who bled in the crypt. Here lies the great anomaly, the financial pivot that altered the destiny of the Republic. How does a collegiate fraternity, born of old money prestige and vast colonial estates, suddenly capture the nervous system of modern finance? This was not a gradual evolution. In the early 20th century, these society members executed a highly synchronized tactical strike. They abandoned the slow decay of inherited land wealth and seized the emerging powerhouses of investment banking. They recognized that the future belonged not to those who owned the soil, but to those who controlled the flow of currency. The old aristocratic estates were static, vulnerable. Corporate law and high finance were liquid, dynamic, and infinitely weaponizable. I watched the archive documents stack up. Suddenly, every major structural change in the American economy bears the subtle fingerprint of a Yale graduate. They became the architects of the newly industrialized world order. This is where the paper ribbons of the ticker tape morph into thick iron chains. They are not simply participating in the market. They are binding the major banks together into a monolithic phalanx. They traded the physical darkness of the New Haven tomb for the gilded boardrooms of Manhattan, but the operating code remained identical. Absolute secrecy, absolute trust, and an utter disregard for the uninitiated masses who believed the stock market was a fair and open game. The paper trail leads inevitably to one colossal nexus of power. Firms like Brown Brothers Harriman. I trace the employment records and find an astonishing statistical distortion. The executive floors of these private banks were heavily populated by society alumni. This concentration of initiated brothers allowed them to coordinate massive macroeconomic shifts entirely outside the purview of federal regulators. They operated in the blind spots of the government, moving like phantoms. When a financial panic struck, or an industrial rival needed to be crushed, no official meetings were required. A whispered conversation over a mahogany desk, a nod across a private dining room, and millions of dollars changed hands. They had essentially bypassed the democratic oversight of the United States economy. The bonds forged in the mud of the initiation ritual now dictated the price of steel, the construction of railroads, and the livelihoods of millions of ordinary workers. Digging deeper into these century-old ledgers, a terrifying new structure emerges from the data. This tight-knit network had effectively created an informal shadow reserve. Capital was no longer just money. It was condensed time, the captured labor of the American populace. And this capital could be swiftly and silently moved to support the political and industrial ambitions of fellow members. If a brother needed funding for a geopolitical maneuver, the shadow reserve provided it instantly. It is a beautiful, melancholic choreography of wealth. The Federal Reserve might print the currency, but the Brotherhood directed its current. I see the invisible threads stretching out from Manhattan, financing foreign coups, funding domestic political campaigns, and quietly suffocating economic competitors. They did not need to break the law because they were in the process of writing the financial architecture that the rest of the nation would be forced to inhabit for a century. By the eve of the Great Depression, the trap had snapped shut. They had successfully built a closed-circuit financial system. The illusion of the American dream suggests that anyone with grit and determination can reach the pinnacle of society. But the forensic evidence in this dusty library proves otherwise. The system was rigged at the genetic level of capital. 99% of the population was permanently excluded from the highest echelons of resource allocation. You watch the numbers on your screen today, trusting the algorithms and the central banks. But you are swimming in a river whose dams were built by 15 men a century ago. When the market crashed, wiping out the life savings of the middle class, this shadow reserve protected its own. They absorbed the losses of their brothers while buying up the bankrupt assets of the uninitiated for pennies. Chaos for the Republic was merely an acquisition opportunity for the Brotherhood. The sheer elegance of this sociological machine is paralyzing. It requires no overt conspiracy, no cartoonish villains plotting in a lair. It relies solely on the predictable algorithm of human greed and the impenetrable trust forged during their college years. The wealth of a booming superpower was seamlessly funneled into the pockets of a curated aristocracy. The iron chains linking the banks were invisible to the public, but their weight was carried on the backs of the working class. Having conquered the financial nervous system of the United States, their appetite for control expanded beyond mere wealth. Capital, after all, is just a tool. The ultimate prize is the shaping of human history itself. As the 1930s drew to a close, and the dark clouds of a global conflict gathered over Europe, the men of the tomb realized that their closed-circuit economy needed protection. They needed an apparatus that could project their will across oceans and borders. The ledgers and transaction receipts in front of me begin to give way to something far more sinister. I'm no longer just looking at bank transfers. I'm looking at shipping manifests for weapons, intelligence dossiers, and the blueprints for a shadow government. The Brotherhood had amassed enough wealth to buy the world. Now, they were preparing to run it. The financial pivot was complete, but it was only the prologue to the darkest chapter of their sociological algorithm. The iron chains of Wall Street were secure. The shadow reserve hummed with infinite power. But as the world plunged into the Second Great War, they would leverage this economic dominance to create an entirely new weapon. They would trade the ticker tape for the encrypted telegraph, and the boardroom for the battlefield. The architects of American capital were about to become the phantoms of global espionage, proving that money is merely the precursor to absolute, unchecked authority. Capital is merely the precursor to absolute authority, as we discovered in the ledgers of Wall Street. The iron chains linking those early 20th century banks were heavy, but they could not stop bullets. When the geopolitical theater erupted into the Second World War, the Brotherhood faced a critical vulnerability. Their closed-circuit financial empire required a new kind of armor. They needed a weapon forged not of steel, but of secrets. The control of information became the ultimate currency. Through the glow of these server racks, I'm tracing the digital ghosts of 1943. The archival data pulls me into the freezing fog of a blacked-out London street. A man in a tailored trench coat slips a classified dossier to a nameless contact in the shadows. We are accustomed to viewing warfare as a clash of muddy infantry and roaring artillery. But true power always retreats to the silence of the back alley, operating far above the bleeding masses in the trenches. When the Republic realized it desperately needed a shadow army to navigate this global slaughter, a profound sociological anomaly occurred. They did not look to the battle-hardened generals or the tactical geniuses of the military academies. That is the great myth of the American intelligence apparatus. They looked instead to the manicured lawns of the Ivy League. The fate of the free world was quietly handed to the very same boys who once wrestled in the mud of a windowless crypt. You assume a spy is a hardened soldier, conditioned by the brutal realities of combat. But the data on my monitors reveals a terrifyingly different truth. I'm cross-referencing the founding charters of the Office of Strategic Services, the immediate precursor to our modern intelligence state. The personnel files do not read like military dossiers. They read like the guest list for an exclusive collegiate regatta. The architects of this shadow war were the heirs to American empires. The numbers are an undeniable forensic trail of aristocratic capture. The Office of Strategic Services was disproportionately staffed by graduates of that specific New Haven University. We're talking about a statistical density that obliterates any notion of a meritocratic draft. The men plotting the sabotage of European railways and the infiltration of enemy high commands were the exact same men who had sworn oaths of eternal loyalty to 15 brothers in a dark, wood-paneled room. Look at the map of Europe stretching across my screens, illuminated by the cold blue light of the service. I'm placing red digital pins on every confirmed intelligence asset from that era. The pattern is not dictated by strategic military logic. The hand placing these pins wears a golden signet ring. The espionage network was essentially a geopolitical fraternity, mapping their collegiate alliances directly onto the bleeding geography of a fractured, burning European continent. Why did the Republic entrust its survival to this sheltered elite? The foundational philosophy of early American intelligence was built on a dark, elitist premise. They believed that true espionage required a specific psychological profile. It demanded the patrician detachment and the absolute, unquestioning loyalty that is cultivated exclusively inside the tomb. A common soldier might break under torture or defect for money, but an aristocrat answers only to his bloodline and his brothers. It is a melancholic realization, staring at these declassified routing numbers and field reports. The tragedy of history is not that bad men conspire, but that brilliant men view the world as a chessboard. These gentlemen spies possessed a neurochemical rewiring, as we observed in their initiation, that prioritized their brotherhood above the laws of the very nation they were sworn to protect. They were a sovereign psychological state, operating entirely within the borders of our own. In this shadowy theater, information was stripped of its moral weight. It was treated simply as a high-value commodity, traded among a tight-knit network of men who once shared the same collegiate dining halls. They bypassed standard military hierarchies with chilling ease. A coded message from behind enemy lines did not travel up the chain of command. It traveled laterally, from one fraternity brother in a London bunker to another sitting comfortably in a Washington office. You trust the historical narrative that the war was won by the sheer grit of the democratic citizen. But the architecture of that victory was strictly highly classified, managed by men who viewed democracy as a chaotic liability. They built an invisible fortress of whispers. Every dossier exchanged in the fog, every intercepted radio transmission, became capital in an underground economy. They were trading secrets with the exact same ruthless efficiency they used to trade railway stocks. The implications of this closed-loop intelligence system are staggering. When you bypass the military hierarchy, you bypass the very concept of oversight. The men of the tomb created a black box of geopolitical action. They decided who lived, who died, and which resistance movements received funding, all based on the quiet consensus of their aristocratic peers. The destiny of millions of souls was decided over a glass of bourbon, completely insulated from the judgment of the voting public. We are unearthing the absolute genesis of the shadow state, revealing how a college crypt hijacked the nervous system of global conflict. If this terrifying scale of sociological manipulation blows your mind too, hit the like button right now. To not miss the ultimate solution to this aristocratic mystery, subscribe to the channel. Do you think a true democracy ever stood a chance against this algorithm of elite control? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. The poetry of this infiltration lies in its utter silence. There was no violent coup. There was no tearing up of the Constitution. The Brotherhood simply walked into the most critical infrastructure of the Republic and locked the door behind them. By making intelligence the exclusive domain of the elite, they ensured that the post-war world would be shaped entirely by their worldview. They wrote the script of the 20th century in invisible ink, leaving us to read only the violent echoes. As I power down the archival queries, the sheer weight of this historical hijacking settles into the freezing air of the server room. The golden signet rings of 1943 forged the template for every covert operation that followed. They turned the messy, blood-soaked reality of global conflict into a sanitized gentleman's game. You are living in the world their shadows constructed, believing in a freedom that was carefully curated by 15 men in a windowless room. The war eventually ended, but the machinery of absolute secrecy they constructed did not dismantle itself. It only grew hungrier. Having tasted the intoxicating power of unchecked global manipulation, these architects of information were preparing for a new, infinitely more dangerous conflict. They had successfully built an aristocratic intelligence apparatus in the shadows of a world war. Now, they were about to drag that terrifying sociological weapon directly into the atomic age. I watched the digital glow of the server room reflect off declassified Central Intelligence Agency charters, tracing the precise moment that aristocratic weapon entered the atomic age. The machinery of absolute secrecy did not dismantle itself when the world map was redrawn. It merely mutated, feeding on the paranoia of the escalating global standoff. We are looking at the catastrophic deployment of this closed-circuit fraternity during the absolute height of nuclear dread. Through the forensic trail of these redacted documents, a bright, sterile briefing room in Langley, Virginia, bleeds into my monitors. The air is thick with the blue haze of cigarette smoke, illuminated only by the harsh, rhythmic clicking of a slide projector. Aerial reconnaissance photographs of the Cuban coastline, the infamous Bay of Pigs, flash across the screen. The men in this room are not elected officials, nor are they seasoned military commanders. You are taught that in a democracy, the fate of the nation rests in the hands of the voting public, especially when the geopolitical stakes are apocalyptic. But when the world actually hangs by a frayed nuclear wire, the terrifying anomaly of this room becomes undeniable. The decisions dictating the survival of millions are not being debated in the open air of Congress. They're being finalized by the shadow of the Brotherhood, a collective mind forged in a New Haven crypt. I isolate the service records of the primary architects constructing American foreign policy during this glacial twilight of the Cold War. The metadata reveals a staggering sociological glitch. The disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion was not a failure of military intelligence. It was a failure of perspective, orchestrated by men bound by oaths of absolute secrecy they had sworn to each other decades prior, kneeling on a mud-caked wrestling mat in their youth. The Central Intelligence Agency did not function as a rational bureaucratic apparatus during its formative, most dangerous years. Cross-referencing these early personnel manifests reveals a haunting truth. It operated largely as an exclusive, heavily armed, private club. The agency was entirely shielded from constitutional checks, congressional oversight, or the prying eyes of the press, protected by an impenetrable, invisible wall of pure elite solidarity. This is the poetry of hidden influence, written in the blood of proxy wars and covert assassinations. The investigator in me searches for a complex conspiracy, but the poet sees a much simpler, more devastating reality. These men did not need to explicitly conspire to bypass the law. Their shared psychological architecture, hardwired during their university initiation, made the very concept of external accountability feel like an insult to their patrician destiny. As the projector clicks to the next slide in that smoke-filled Langley room, I analyze the group dynamics using modern behavioral science models. Their shared socioeconomic background created a lethal, hermetically sealed echo chamber. They were brilliant men, but they were sociologically blind. Massive strategic failures inevitably bloomed from this soil, simply because dissenting viewpoints from outside their rarefied atmosphere were systematically ignored. When an entire intelligence apparatus is drawn from the exact same genetic and financial pool, the algorithm of power begins to break down. They could calculate the tonnage of Soviet steel, but they could not comprehend the genuine revolutionary fervor of impoverished farmers. The collective unconscious of the tomb simply lacked the vocabulary to understand a world outside its own privileged, mahogany-paneled corridors, leading to devastating miscalculations. Yet the most terrifying aspect of this forensic trail is not the incompetence, but the immunity. The Brotherhood's overwhelming influence across the upper echelons of government ensured that these catastrophic covert operations were entirely shielded from democratic accountability. No one in that room faced a tribunal for the lives lost on those Cuban beaches. They protected their own, treating the global theater of the Cold War as a high-stakes chess match. To them, the pawns were merely statistics printed on fresh ticker tape, a game played by gentlemen whose loyalty to the fraternity always superseded their duty to the Republic. I trace the encrypted communications flowing out of that briefing room, watching how a deeply rooted psychological bond can warp the destiny of the entire human species. The abyss stares back through these declassified files, showing us the true cost of outsourcing our reality to the shadows. The data points on my monitors coalesce into a terrifying symphony of unchecked authority. This was not a rogue element within the government. This was the government itself, hollowed out and replaced by a closed sociological loop. You assume the apparatus of the state is designed to protect your interests, but the math reveals a completely different objective. The primary function of this network was to preserve the hegemony of the men sitting in that sterile room. Every assassination plot, every funded insurgency, every rigged election in the global South can be traced back to this singular, terrifying vulnerability in our democratic design. The psychological deconstruction they underwent at 21 years old became the operational doctrine of a superpower. They believed they were the rightful shepherds of human history, and their artificially induced trauma bond gave them the absolute, chilling confidence to act on it. I pull up the casualty reports from the proxy conflicts authorized during this era, juxtaposing the death tolls against the immaculate graduation portraits of these intelligence directors. The contrast is an existential horror. Millions of lives were ground into dust, caught in the gears of a geopolitical machine engineered by a handful of college roommates. The sheer predictability of this sociological algorithm is what makes the historical record so agonizing. We are looking at a system that effectively hacked the survival instinct of the nation, redirecting the colossal resources of the American military-industrial complex to serve the psychological needs of a tiny, insular elite. The cold reason of the data leaves no room for doubt. The Brotherhood did not just participate in the Cold War. They curated its paranoia, ensuring their specific breed of aristocratic secrecy became the permanent default state of the world. As the smoke clears from those mid-century briefing rooms, a darker realization emerges from the server logs. They had successfully conquered the hidden world of intelligence and finance, but operating in the shadows was no longer sufficient. The logic of their artificial brotherhood demanded total spectrum dominance. The algorithm was preparing to step out of the encrypted darkness and directly seize the highest, most visible office of public power in the land. The algorithm of power no longer needed the cover of encrypted darkness or the smoke of subterranean briefing rooms. It was ready to step out into the blinding, unforgiving light of the American executive branch. I watched the archival footage of the 2004 presidential debates flicker across the monitors. The glare of the studio lights feels almost obscene after the shadows of the intelligence state. But this is where the ultimate psychological operation was deployed. On the split-screen television broadcast, two candidates stand at their respective podiums, draped in the opposing colors of a deeply divided nation. The ambient noise of the audience, the fierce partisan cheering, slowly fades from the audio track. It is replaced by the low, rhythmic thud of a single, collective heartbeat. Look closely at the geometry of this stage. You are not witnessing a democratic contest. You are observing the pristine architecture of a rigged casino. What happens to the soul of a republic when the leaders of both major political factions harbor the exact same foundational secret? The illusion of choice is the most potent narcotic ever synthesized by a ruling class. You step into a voting booth, pulling a lever or touching a screen, believing that your solitary action alters the trajectory of fate. But the forensic trail we have followed leads directly to this agonizing realization. The House always wins, because the House owns both players. The data from that November presents a statistical corpse that defies every established law of political science. In the 2004 United States presidential election, both major party candidates were not just from the same socioeconomic stratum. They were sworn alumni of the exact same 15-person collegiate cohort we tracked to that windowless brownstone in New Haven. Two opposing avatars of American ideology, forged in the very same psychological crucible. This is the poetry of a closed system, a terrifyingly elegant loop where opposition is entirely manufactured. I pause the broadcast, freezing their faces mid-sentence. In the silence of the server room, the masks of partisan hostility dissolve, and the features of the two rivals begin to metaphorically merge. The fierce debates over tax policy and foreign intervention become a highly choreographed theatrical performance, a shadow play cast upon the walls of a continent-sized cave. Calculate the raw, brutal mathematics of this anomaly. We are looking at a sprawling, chaotic nation of nearly 300 million independent citizens, all theoretically eligible to ascend to the highest political office. The statistical probability of two men from that vast ocean of humanity sharing this specific, highly secretive undergraduate background is infinitesimally small. It shatters any mathematical model of a random, functioning democratic process. You have a better chance of being struck by lightning while holding a winning lottery ticket than witnessing this sociological eclipse organically. This was not a coincidence. A coincidence is a glitch in the chaotic noise of the universe. This was a flawless execution of code. The ballot box was hacked not with digital malware, but with a century-old algorithm of elite social reproduction, ensuring the outcome was entirely secure long before the very first vote was ever cast. This phenomenon exposes the dark, beating heart of how power truly replicates itself in the modern era. It demonstrates the precise mechanics of elite reproduction, where a ruling class meticulously curates its successors, regardless of superficial partisan divides. The political spectrum you are taught to believe in, the fierce cultural battle between left and right, is merely a localized weather pattern. The Brotherhood operates as the climate itself, totally indifferent to the storms below. I trace the political lineage of these men, matching their campaign promises against the silent oaths they took upon that mud-caked wrestling mat decades prior. The tragedy of this architecture is how beautifully it preys upon the human desire for agency. Millions of citizens spent billions of dollars and countless hours campaigning, crying, and fighting for a political revolution that was mathematically preempted by a private dining club in Connecticut. The forensic evidence demands a complete reevaluation of American history. It reveals that the executive branch has frequently functioned less as a chaotic reflection of the popular will and more as a controlled, rotating chairmanship of a closed aristocratic network. Presidents are not elected. They are installed by the sheer gravity of their institutional backing. The Oval Office becomes just another paneled room where the Brotherhood calmly conducts its geopolitical business. Through this lens, the passionate voter is reduced to a tragic figure, a ghost haunting a machine they simply cannot comprehend. You argue with your neighbor over macroeconomic policy, entirely unaware that the architects of your financial reality share the same secret handshakes and offshore portfolios. The genius of the crypt is that it never needed to abolish democracy. It simply bypassed it, turning the Electoral College into a sophisticated mechanism for laundering elite consensus. This specific election was not an isolated breach of the social contract. It was the absolute zenith of the Brotherhood's operational capacity, the moment the trauma bond went fully public while remaining entirely invisible to the untrained eye. They placed the psychological equivalent of a two-way mirror in front of the American public. You look into the glass and see your own civic duty reflected back, while they stand comfortably in the dark, quietly managing your destiny. True hegemony is achieved when the prisoner fights fiercely to defend the walls of their own cell. By supplying the leadership for both opposing armies, the network guarantees that no matter which ideology triumphs on a Tuesday in November, the foundational structure of the shadow state remains violently undisturbed. The intelligence agencies receive their black budget funding, the shadow banks secure their bailouts, and the ancient, hungry engine of capital grinds endlessly onward. I let the television broadcast resume its natural speed. The two candidates shake hands, flashing practiced, hollow smiles at the flashing cameras. The American public cheers, entirely oblivious to the invisible iron chains linking the wrists of the two men on stage. It is a masterpiece of sociological control, a living monument to the power of artificial scarcity applied to human governance. The crypt had swallowed the Republic whole, without firing a single shot on the battlefield. But this absolute monopoly on the physical levers of government was achieved in an era that was already dying. As the 21st century accelerated, the nature of power itself began to violently mutate, shifting from wood-paneled rooms to fiber-optic cables. The question that haunts me now is not how they captured the presidency in the past, but how this 19th century psychological virus adapted to the relentless, unforgiving transparency of the incoming digital age. I watched the blue light of the server farm wash over the face of the intelligence analyst. We have left the wood-paneled rooms and entered the cold, humming cathedral of the 2026 digital architecture. The 19th century psychological virus we tracked through history did not die in the blinding light of modern transparency. It merely shed its physical body. You might think the era of fiber-optic cables and open-source data would incinerate a secret society. Instead, the analyst stares at a digital map where lines of code replace the heavy iron chains of 20th century Wall Street. Algorithms process billions of data points every second, a relentless tide of information designed to expose every shadow. Yet, beneath this ocean of radical transparency, the exact same centralized nodes of power remain violently undisturbed. The anomaly glowing on the monitors is terrifyingly poetic. The architecture of influence has completely decoupled from geography. We are forced to confront the ultimate paradox of our hyper-connected age, a riddle the analyst traces across multiple glowing screens. We live in an era of omnipresent surveillance. A single misplaced geotag can topple a geopolitical regime. So how does a collegiate fraternity maintain its absolute grip on your reality? The physical crypt in New Haven is now just a decoy. It is an empty shell left behind by an organism that successfully uploaded its consciousness into the ether. The investigator's fingers fly across the keyboard, cross-referencing declassified intelligence charters with contemporary tech sector capitalization tables. In our current era of open-source intelligence, the thick sandstone walls of the original building are completely irrelevant. The true power no longer requires a locked door to hide behind. It thrives entirely in the open, relying on the institutional capture of the exact digital infrastructure you use to navigate your daily life. You leave a digital footprint with every financial transaction, every search query, and every heartbeat recorded by your smartwatch. But the analyst sees the negative space in this data ocean. The silent voids where the apex predators swim undetected. They do not hide their names, they hide their allegiances. The society understood that when everything is visible, true secrecy is achieved through overwhelming algorithmic complexity. They became the architects of the labyrinth itself. The glowing lines on the monitor shift from historical intelligence nodes to the bleeding edge of the 21st century economy. The network has seamlessly evolved, placing its rigorously vetted alumni at the critical choke points of modern human civilization. We are not just looking at traditional shadow finance anymore. The analyst isolates deep connections within decentralized cryptocurrency regulation and the foundational development of artificial intelligence. This is the cold, terrifying thrill of our investigation, watching the ancient trauma bond wrap its fingers around the future. The men who control the algorithmic models defining artificial truth share the exact same psychological architecture as the men who orchestrated the Cold War. You trust the machine to be perfectly impartial, but this digital oracle is built by a brotherhood whose primary allegiance is to its own survival. Occasionally, a whistleblower shatters the surface tension. A database is breached, a roster is published, and the names of the initiates are dragged into the unforgiving light of public forums. You expect the system to collapse under this sudden transparency. Yet, the analyst watches the network absorb the shockwave without a single tremor. The names are irrelevant because the underlying sociological mechanism remains entirely uncompromised. The true magic of the crypt is its ability to effortlessly bypass the democratic illusion of modern meritocracy. While you compete in a grueling, planetary-scale rat race for resources and influence, they operate on a parallel track. This shadow track is built upon absolute, pre-established trust networks. You need a flawless resume to enter the room. They only need the silent, unbroken echo of an oath sworn in the dark decades ago. The psychological bond supersedes all modern digital scrutiny. It is a profound tragedy, a realization that our vast, interconnected civilization is still chained to the tribal mechanics of the Paleolithic era. The server farm hums around us, a temple to human intellect. Yet, it is ultimately governed by the primal fear of betrayal. The society solved the fundamental problem of apex predators, how to trust the man standing directly behind you. That absolute trust is the most valuable currency on Earth. The blinking blue lights reflect in the analyst's eyes, mapping the final, inescapable conclusion of this forensic trail. They have successfully translated a localized, 19th-century psychological bond into global, 21st-century institutional leverage. The algorithm of elite control is completely platform agnostic. It does not matter if the currency is gold, fiat paper, or decentralized tokens. The invisible hand guiding the market wears the exact same golden signet ring. We hunted a ghost through the archives of history, expecting to find an outdated relic of American aristocracy crumbling under the weight of time. Instead, we found a highly adaptive, predatory organism that has woven itself into the very fabric of your digital existence. The analyst leans back from the monitors, the heavy silence of the room screaming a truth that cannot be unseen. The tomb is no longer a physical building. It is the operating system of our reality. Every time you agree to a terms of service update, you are interacting with the modern iteration of that windowless brownstone. Every time you entrust your capital to a decentralized exchange, you are stepping into their domain. You are a guest in their digital architecture, a data point generating wealth for a fraternity you will never be invited to join. The poetry of this absolute control is its total silence. You feel entirely free, even as the cage closes around you. The cold light of the server farm feels like the twilight of human agency. We built a machine to connect the world, to democratize knowledge and shatter the ancient monopolies on power. But the architects simply bought the machine. The analyst powers down the monitors one by one. I watch the map of global influence fade to black, leaving only the reflection of a society that refuses to surrender its crown. The digital crypt is fully operational, silently processing the fate of billions while we argue over the shadows on the cave wall. But to truly understand the inevitable nature of this shadow state, we must step back from the blinking servers. We must look at the entirety of the human condition. We must leave the matrix and return to the physical world to ask the most terrifying philosophical question of all. We step out of the sterile glow of the server farm and back into the cold Connecticut night. The archivist closes the ledger for the final time. High above High Street, our perspective pulls back, leaving the windowless sandstone facade far below. The tomb shrinks into the sprawling Gothic geometry of the university, becoming a tiny, silent atom suspended in the vast, sleeping organism of the city. From this dizzying altitude, the architecture of power loses its mystique. The forensic trail we just walked proves that this society was never a magical anomaly or a supernatural cabal. It is, quite simply, a highly efficient, brutally logical sociological machine. It was engineered to solve the single most difficult problem in human governance: establishing absolute trust among apex predators. We traced their fingerprints across an entire century of history. We watched them transition from inherited land wealth to the iron chains of Wall Street, to the clandestine corridors of the Central Intelligence Agency, and finally, into the digital nervous system of modern shadow finance. We spent this investigation hunting a parasite, desperately searching for the anomaly that infected our republic. But the final verdict of this case offers no comforting villains. The terrifying philosophical truth, the undeniable proof that closes our investigation, is that the anomaly does not exist. The revelation is not that a small, insulated group of men conspired in the dark to rule the world. The devastating, melancholic revelation is that the world actively and desperately demands to be ruled. Sociologists call it the iron law of oligarchy. It is the inescapable, crushing gravity of civilization. Every human hierarchy, no matter how democratic its founding ideals, naturally and inevitably collapses into rule by a concentrated elite. The collegiate crypt did not invent this biological imperative. It merely perfected the psychological crucible necessary to formalize and weaponize it. You step into the voting booth. You read the declassified intelligence reports. You look at the mathematical absurdity of the 2004 presidential election, and you believe the system is fundamentally broken. But I am telling you, with the full weight of a century of forensic data, that the system is functioning exactly as it was mathematically designed to function from the very beginning. The true power of the Brotherhood does not reside in the decaying bricks of that New Haven brownstone. It does not exist in the mud-caked wrestling mats or the whispered confessions of a simulated death. The algorithm of elite control draws its power directly from our own enduring psychological need for a centralized, highly predictable architecture of authority to shield us from the unknown. Ultimately, the tomb is a dark, uncompromising mirror, reflecting the fragile psychology of our own society. We tolerate the existence of the shadow state. We willingly accept the illusion of political choice, and we allow the intelligence apparatus to operate beyond our reach, because we are deeply, existentially terrified of the chaotic, blood-soaked void that would open up without their governance. This is the intellectual horror we are left with. We are not prisoners of a grand conspiracy. We are volunteers in an oligarchy. We surrendered our agency for the comforting illusion of stability, the invisible hand guiding the market, the quiet men orchestrating global conflicts. They are merely filling a vacuum that human sociology cannot bear to leave empty. The elite are a tragic inevitability. If this investigation has shattered your perception of global power, I need you to leave your final verdict in the comments below. Write it down to solidify the reality of the machine we live inside. And if you are ready to keep dissecting the hidden mechanics of our world, hit the subscribe button. Join us, not just to consume content, but to continue this forensic autopsy of human civilization. The perspective reaches the upper atmosphere, and the lights of the American empire fade into the cold curvature of the earth. We are but a fleeting moment in the dark eye of eternity, clinging to a fragile blue sphere governed by the invisible threads of a college crypt. The grand illusion is dispelled. The case is officially closed, but the machinery grinds on in the silence. I am signing off.